Okay. Jason's our standard reader. So go on, Jason. And if you want to read the notes, I suggest you do. I've actually started to find them very helpful. So just say, okay, note one, and then go back to the text. Tell us where you are. You ready? Okay. We're on 479.
Yeah. Part one, the sustaining force of creation and the dual nature of man. Rabbi, until now we have spoken about God's divine emanations that give rise to everything that happens in the world. At this point, we need to explain the nature of the lower worlds, the changes that take place in them, and the laws that shape them. All this is also a result of one of God's divine emanations. Nevertheless, it is a different type. The other emanations are the means through which God acts upon created beings, whereas this emanation works within the created beings. Like the other emanations, it is certainly a direct product of the divine world. Note one, the first chapter of the Torah describes how God brought all of existence into being through the 10 divine utterances. These utterances continue to sustain all the existence every moment. As the verses of the book of Tehillim state, by the word of God the heavens were made, and forever God, your word stands firm in the heavens. Back to the text. Furthermore, it is drawn after the other emanations as we explained above, end of chapter 6, part 2, and we will discuss later on, God willing, part 2 of this chapter. Footnote 2. Although this emanation is different from the other emanations, it is still intimately connected with them. We will see in part 2 of the chapter how all the emanations are directed towards the lower worlds and particularly towards the Jewish people. The second type of emanation acts within the lower worlds, governing the patterns of their existence and receiving the other emanations. It is the relationship and dynamic between these two types of emanations that define the nature of the world. Back to the text. However, what we need to discern now is that all the actions God brings about in the world form one distinct category, while the general existence of creatures that experience these actions forms another. When we investigate the first category, we gain an understanding of the system of his divine emanations that act upon the world. When we investigate the second category, we gain an understanding of the whole system of changes within the creatures as they become more elevated or debased. Footnote 3, the emanations that act upon the world are responsible for everything that happens in the world. The second type of emanation is responsible for the existence of creatures and their changes. Therefore, by examining what happens in the world, we can gain an understanding of the first type of emanation. And by examining the existence of living creatures and their changes, we can gain an understanding of the second type. We also understand all the details that depend upon this process of change. This is what we will now explain. I've already told you that the existence of creatures...
There's a great commentator on the Mishnayot called the... Quick. Okay, I have one right here. I forget his name, gosh. Yontiv, anyway, it says in the Ethics of the Fathers, a person should be able to know what to answer a heretic. So he says an interesting thing there. He says if a person asks themselves 6 questions, they'll understand something. What, why, how, when, whom, and to whom. If there's a relationship. So I've often used that actually as trying to confront an idea or a concept and ask myself those 6 questions. What is it? Why does it exist? How does it exist? Where, when, how, and whom. Is that, I think it's 7 actually. Okay, whatever. The last list is, I think, 7. But so I think it sounds like over here, it would be useful for us maybe to delineate about, what the creatures are and the emanations that bring that about and the changes within them. And then how or or maybe one other one. Sometimes the two most important questions are normally what and why. What is it and why is it? But it sounds like over here it's almost like the creatures, and then what they get up to, who they are and what they get up to. Okay, I thought that might break down easier into one of those two categories, but simply not. But yes, something like that, right? Okay, let's go on.
I already told you that the existence of creatures also depends exclusively on God's word. Creatures can only exist as a result of his divine emanation, as connection to the creation. If God were to remove this emanation and connection, the entire creation would immediately turn into nothingness. Therefore, it is clear that the force emanates from God, all existing things, in order to maintain their existence. For example, just as the body is sustained by the soul and would obviously cease to exist without it, so too all existing creatures are sustained by divine force and would cease to exist without it.
Even though the Rav Chaim of Volozhin points out there's a big difference there, right? When the soul animates the body, that's in Jewish thinking. It's not just the heart beating, but there's a soul that resides in the body that gives it life force and maybe even is the cause of the heart pumping. When a person's soul leaves them, so then the body is left, inanimate. But the body still exists. That's why we have to bury it, etc. Right? If God would stop emanating his energy into the being, that it's more like a projector, right? So you have a light projecting an image on a screen. When you turn off the projector, the images don't die, all right? They don't just fall down. They cease to exist because they would just, and I think we've discussed that many times. That's the name we give God as the Hamakom. He's the place, right? He's the canvas on which we exist. Should he take that away, we just simply could not exist. So there is a slight difference. I'm surprised that he says it's the exact same thing. Okay. He says nifsad. I'm not sure in the Hebrew it means, I don't know. Uri, what do you think? Nifsad? It's not necessarily cease to exist. It would be...
I think that we don't need to translate it into modern Hebrew, because nifsad will be lost, like in the English
right.
term, to lose a fight or to lose a game. It will be lost, namely. I don't think that we need to translate. I think he does mean that we will be lost to existence.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, even though that Hebrew doesn't translate to.
Right. Okay.
By the way, I think I want to tell you that it occurred to me. Thank you, Super. That his writing in Hebrew is just absolutely beautiful, because he's writing in the beginning of the 18th century when Hebrew was not a live language again yet, right? Yeah. It was only a biblical prayer language, and I've read this about him before, that he really is respected for his Hebrew writing, but the way he writes is so beautiful. He writes so succinctly, and so poetically. It's great. It's great to read it. I wish I could share it with you. Mm.
Translation is somewhat less succinct.
Didn't do a bad job. I'm quite impressed with it.
Well, I mean, Uri, your point is so well taken, though, because it's not even his natural. I mean, yeah, it's not a live language, but of course, it's not his natural language. He was Italian. So I don't know what else he spoke. I mean, it'd be interesting to know if he spoke Italian and Yiddish, of course, right? Did he
Ladino.
also? What about Aramaic? Because I don't know how long it had been since many of the prayer books would have been in Aramaic, right? Much earlier, but would he have been?
No, way earlier. Yeah,
Yeah.
but you just, you know,
His knowledge of Hebrew is that good. I mean, I don't know.
yeah, but you have, you know, as much as Hebrew was not spoken, it's always been pretty much, actually, almost an except. The Talmud's a bit of an exception that it's in Aramaic, and even the Aramaic there is very, you know, it's bringing in verses all the time. It's very similar to Hebrew, but since the time, you know, from the time of the Rambam, Maimonides, and onwards, you know, Hebrew language became the language of the Torah for almost, you know, exclusively for Torah study. So, you know, you've got you know, any serious Talmud Chacham is going to, at some stage, you know, is going to be exposed to a lot of Hebrew. And if they have a head for grammar and a desire for, you know, they will become good at it. I think that's almost expected. I'm not taking away from your comments. Sorry, I know his Hebrew is beautiful. Okay.
You know, the difference maybe is that, you know, the Hebrew of the Bible itself and the Hebrew of, no, I mean, I guess, you know.
Have you ever read Rambam? Rambam also has this incredibly beautiful, succinct way. It's not as poetic, but you know, he writes in a very you can feel it, that it's an elevated Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Sorry, that was a tangent.
Good one. Okay. Jason, back to our thus
our sages describe this force as the soul of souls. This is 5. The soul gives life to the body, but this force gives life even to the souls. Therefore, it is called the soul of souls. Back to the text, I've already mentioned that this force is to be considered as separate from all the other emanations that God transmits to the world, since it is directed only towards the existence of beings and not towards the events that happen to them. We need to understand, with regard to this subject, are the changing time periods that created beings go through, and how their nature changes as they become more elevated or debased, as we explained. All these matters are certainly dependent on God's word, according to the laws he set in place for the existence of created beings. After all, these beings cannot become more elevated or debased than allowed by the laws of their existence. Let us now understand what we can about these changes in the existence of created beings, since they can be attributed to this force that emanates from God and his connection to the creation. Footnote 6. The subject we are explaining is the emanating force that sustains and regulates the existence of the world. One of the principal functions of this force is to control all the different phases of elevation and descent that the creatures of the world go through. By analyzing in detail the nature of beings and these changes in level, we will, by transference, gain an understanding of the invisible sustaining force that is behind all existence. Therefore, in the following paragraphs, we will begin to analyze the ups and downs of man, who is the central element of existence. The most essential element in creation is mankind, and the most essential element of mankind is the Jewish people. Our sages have already taught us the ministering angels dwell outside, while the Jewish people dwell within, as is written. At the time, the angels will ask the Jewish people what God has done. 7. At the time of the Geulah, the Jewish people will dwell within, will be closer to God's presence than the angels themselves, and will have a clear understanding of his ways. The angels will therefore have to ask us what God is doing. However, we need to identify 2 opposing tendencies that exist within man. Our sages said of this, if man is worthy, they say to him, you are the most important element of the entire creation. If he is not worthy, they say to him, a flea is more important than you. The meaning of this is that there is no other creature as prone to evil as man is. He is able to sin and rebel, God forbid, and his negative drives dominate him from when he is still young. This is not found in any other creature. On the other hand, when man rectifies and perfects himself, he becomes more elevated than anything in the creation and is able to attach himself to God. All other creatures then become secondary to him, as our sages described in the statement quoted above. Similarly, our sages explained why the Jewish people are compared to the stars in heavens and the dust of the earth. They can rise to the heavens or fall to the dust. Footnote 8. God promised Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the dust of the earth. Here, this dual style of comparison is taken to hint at the potential for greatness or lowliness contained within man. Text. This is because God's divine wisdom decreed that man's true nature should be extremely elevated and noble. However, he first lowered man's level so that evil could have power over him. When he falls low, he becomes lower than all other creatures, and evil holds sway over him more than over any other creature. But once he becomes rectified and perfected, he regains his true exalted status. He becomes elevated above the entire creation, rising to a level that no other creature is able to reach. We already know that the ultimate purpose of the changing events in the cycle of history is the revelation of God's
Hang on a second. Right, that's an amazing thing about humans, right? Humans can rise to the highest level of purity, of sanctification, elevation, and the same people, right? The same people can go down to the lowest of the low, right? It's a crazy thing how wide the range of a human is. You know, the two things. The Vilna Gaon says it's like a rider on a horse. Says if the horse has sway, it's going to take the rider with him and it's just go crazy and do crazy things. If the rider's able to control the horse and tame it, so then he can be the most elevated person, right? He's got a horse. In the Bereshit story, man is called Adam because he's taken from the Adamah, from the ground. And the Shla said that that word Adamah can also be read Adameh. I will be similar, domeh, right? So I think it's based on a verse, Adameh le'elyon. I will be similar to God. So in the very name Adam is this. Rav Wolbe points this out, that in the name Adam there is this dichotomy of potential, right? Are you going to be Adamah? You're just going to live your life and go down and down and down until eventually just you're God, you know, you're dust, or Adameh? Are you going to be someone that becomes an image, a true representation of something godly and uplifted in this world? I think we all know that, right? There are times when we can be very good and high and elevated, and other times we're like, what the heck, right? So it's good to know we're in good company and we're doing what we're meant to be doing, as he says here in the book. Okay. We already know.
We already know that the ultimate purpose of the changing events in the cycle of history is the revelation of God's oneness. Chapter 2, part 1. So footnote 9, we have seen that man has a dual nature because his true essence is extremely elevated, but God lowered him and made him subject to evil. Ramchal now explains why God made man this way and why this makes his reward so great. Back to the text. This will come about when evil itself bears witness to God's oneness and it becomes transformed into a vehicle for good. See chapter 2, parts 3 and 4. This is what is meant by the verse, I will give thanks to you even for the times when your anger blazed against me, as I've explained above, end of chapter 5, part 2. Footnote 10, when the Gulag comes, we will understand how evil itself and all the bad things that happen to us, God's anger, were all consequences of his love for us. They were all part of the process leading to the perfection of the world and the revelation of his oneness. Back to the text. This whole process only became possible through the lowering of man's existence, which caused evil to come to power over him. As a result, when he perfects himself and he becomes elevated, he transforms evil into a vehicle for good. This is because the evil inclination itself is what enables him to acquire his merit. We can see that his initial diminishment ends up being the cause of his perfection. Were he to have remained at an elevated level where evil could have no association with him, he would not have been able to bring about the transformation of evil into good, which is the essential means of perfecting the creation. Footnote 11. Now we understand why God made man this way he did, made man the way he did. The ultimate purpose of the world is the revelation of God's oneness. This is achieved by evil becoming transformed into a vehicle for good. In this way, we will see how even evil, which seemed to contradict God's absolute goodness and oneness, was really only created by God as a means to bestow good. Evil is transformed into good by its attachment to man. When he overcomes evil and perfects himself, he gains great merit. Evil then becomes the cause of man's greatest good and bears witness to God's oneness and power over every element of creation. In this way, man fulfills the ultimate purpose of creation.
So,
back to tense, we know that God made man's true.
Hang on one second. So, how do you guys understand this? What is the how does he say it here? Evil is a vehicle, is transformed, a transformation of evil into good. That's a very deep concept. How do you understand it?
I feel like he kind of made this point before in the earlier chapters, where we're talking about, talking more about the dual nature of man and the choice that man makes to either, debase himself by following sort of the instinct or the Yetzer Hara, or if you want to more broadly sort of define it as being evil, whatever, doing what you're not supposed to be doing, essentially. And so by perfecting oneself and by essentially using the evil that sort of either is in the ether or present with other people or in society or within oneself, by overcoming it through action, the evil becomes the vehicle through which you perfect yourself and also ultimately through which God's oneness is revealed in the world. So it can't be done without that conflict, between what is good and what is evil, and with good ultimately sort of vanquishing the evil. And so in that way, evil is sort of the tool, the catalyst for bringing about God's kind of oneness.
Right. Okay. So I think over here, whereas before, maybe the focus was man, here it's on the emanation. So you see that,
yeah,
it's the emanation of evil, which really ultimately is perfect. It becomes good through man, and also maybe at the end of times through this revelation. So it's almost like both God and man find their perfection. I mean, in quotation marks for God, right? God doesn't need it.
Yeah.
But both God and man use evil as their like stepping stone to greatness. And it's interesting here. I'm struggling a bit with it, whether
read it almost as like tikkun olam, where there's destruction or whatnot in the world, and then you have to stoop low to sort of pick it up and make that good, that evil into good. And that's the by the kind of sweat of your brow and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah. No, that very much. This is the tikkun olam. But it is. I tell you, my question is it? I guess in this section, it's not so much about, well, man could have just, what does he say? Ezra, when he perfects himself and becomes elevated, he transforms evil into a vehicle for good. This is because the evil inclination itself is what enables him to acquire merit. You can see that his initial diminishment ends up being the cause of his perfection. Were he to have remained at an elevated level where evil could have no association, he would not have been able to bring about the transformation of evil into good, which is the essential means of perfecting creation. Yeah, so I think what he's saying here in the end is that's where we partner with God, right? Meaning, yes, man overcoming evil is his own merit, but it's also, in terms of the big picture, transforming evil. It's using evil for that good purpose that it was created for. So just like God is going to use it to bring about his oneness, his perfection, by people overcoming it, it also is given it, it's transformed. We see it as it's utilized properly. Does that make sense?
We see it for its purpose.
Yeah, yeah.
As opposed to seeing it as something that is purposeless and to be questioned only with regards to why it exists.
Right. And we see it for its purpose, and it actually fulfills its purpose, or its purpose is fulfilled once we do that.
There's a distinction here, though, because the focus is all on personal transformation and internal transformation of oneself as distinct from effectuating change in the world external to oneself. There's a difference there. So like what Jason was saying, with the way I conceive of tikkun olam is not that in that way, or at least I don't think of it being that way. I think of it as being like you don't get to perfect the world until you've sort of, to some extent, perfected yourself, and then you can go out as a rectified person and do other good things, right? I don't know. I don't know what the order is, but there seems to be a difference here because he doesn't talk about changing the world in a way for good. This whole context of this discussion is about a personal, internal transformation whereby the individual conquers the evil right within, and then that leads to the change, the external change, and even that leads to ultimately an abstraction where evil as a force, as an emanation, is conquered. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, you could, by overcoming your Yetzer Hara, you are actually involved in Tikkun Olam.
Maybe it's the translation difference here or something, because on this page, he writes, as a result, when he perfects himself and becomes elevated, he transforms evil into a vehicle for good. So it's not really evil being transformed into good. It's just sort of recognizing that you utilize this as a stepping stone to transform yourself and become a better human.
I think that is its transformation.
But then
until evil is used for good, it's really evil. Mm-hmm. It hasn't fulfilled its function. Yeah, go on.
but then a few lines further, he says, were he to have remained at an elevated level where evil could have no association with him, he would not have been able to bring about the transformation of evil into good. So that's where I get the sort of, you go back down and you get the bad part of the world and you elevate that evil into good. So they're two separate things. There's you figuring out that evil was able to transform you into a good person, and then also going back down, interacting with the evil and bringing that evil and transforming that evil, whatever it is, into something that is no longer evil. And that may be just a manifestation of the translation, at least in the way I'm reading it.
I think I hear what you're saying. That it's kind of what I wanted to discuss. I think his focus here is on the evil, right? On the evil emanation. I'm not sure. I'm reading it as one thing, meaning when we overcome the evil, that transforms the evil into good because it served a good purpose. Right? It helped us to become elevated, and therefore, okay, it's done its job, right? It's used. I don't think it changes, right? The Yetzer Hara is not going to disappear, but it now can be counted as part of the good in the world. Right? It's a good challenge. You know, a good challenge is one that brings out the best in people. And then you look at the challenge as well. That was a really, good thing to go through. I was actually once on a plane that had to prepare for crash landing. Have I told you this? It's my only real story.
I like it. Tell it again. I remember.
Okay.
I don't remember how this ends. Obviously, it ends not terribly.
So, well, my normal ending is, well, we prepared for crash landing and came down, and yeah, the plane crashed, and now I'm here in hell with you guys. How did you get here? Okay, but
Rabbi, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
With regard to frankly transforming an evil to something that is not evil any longer, but rather is good, plainly. I think that we can look at challenges that we overcame as potential things that that were evil had we succumbed to them, but we overcame them, and so they're not that bad anymore. But there is suffering or tragedy that that results in some modicum of personal growth, even though that suffering or tragedy doesn't go away. And I think that I hesitate to interpret what we're reading as implying that just because of the personal growth or transformation in a positive way, that this transforms the suffering into something that is plainly good. For some people, that suffering remains, or that suffering or tragedy was something that was not reversed. We can always turn to the Holocaust thing, and I hate to do that, so I think that we should not, because it's such an extreme, weird example. But it's a death in the family, right? Suppose that a person has a child who dies, and through it, over the next 5 or 10 years, perhaps the parent becomes more wise and knowledgeable about what's important in life, and more supportive of his or her spouse, and I don't know what, whatever, just becomes better in some ways than he was before that. It doesn't make that tragedy plainly a good. That tragedy was a tragedy. So how do we deal with that, or do we not need to deal with it because our interpretation of the transformation of evil to good is too plain and doesn't consider these situations?
Yeah. I'll rephrase your question. We're basically saying over here is that the end justifies the means, right? So it's the evils in the world, man overcomes it, and great, right? It's an evil thing, it's a bad thing, but it led to a good outcome. You're saying sometimes that's not so simple, right? Sometimes you'd look at them, you weigh them up, you say, well, no, it's a very high price to pay. It's a great question, Uri. I like the way you bringing that in. Yeah, he's speaking on a very abstract, general level, where I'm not sure if there's any hint in this how to answer that. Maybe later on.
Yeah, or perhaps we don't need to necessarily interpret the text as really suggesting that the evil frankly and plainly becomes good. It does not. It's like, if you can take the good that is an amazing person like Viktor Frankl, right? What a good person he must have been to develop the philosophy that he had and to write the amazing books that he wrote apropos the Holocaust. It doesn't make the Holocaust plainly a good event.
Right. And I don't think. Yeah. Also, my interpretation of the text is that it's not like you look back and you see the evil now as good. No, the evil's evil, but a good thing did come out, and in that sense, that was the end of my plane crash story. Is that it was a harrowing experience. I thought I was gonna die for 40 minutes. It's almost like last Purim. No, I think of it as it's an experience you would never want, you'd never ask for, you'd never opt for that. But now that I had it, I see back, it was like, wow, I learned a lot from it. It was, would I do it again? No, I would never do it again. Not, I don't see it as a good thing. But I really did come out of it elevated. It was very,
right.
So I think something like that. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Jason, you want to continue?
Sure. The bottom of 485, we know that God made man's true nature extremely great. However, he did not make his goodness a fixed part of him in such a way that he would be able to maintain his glorious state. This is footnote 12. Having explained why God made man a mixture of greatness and lowliness, the Ramchal now explains more specifically how God structured man's being in order to achieve this purpose. God made man's greatness something which fixed part of him. Rather, he lacks completion and must struggle to elevate himself by overcoming his negative drives. If he succeeds, God draws him close and grants him the greatness that he had lost. Just as the moon was originally as bright as the sun, but was diminished to the point that it is now only dimly reflects its light, so too man's light has been dimmed. However, just as we have been promised that at the time of the Golan, the moon will once again perfectly reflect the light of the sun, so too man will regain his destined greatness and reflect the brilliance of God's light. Back to the test. Instead, he made him like the moon, which is inherently dark and needs to receive its light from the sun before it can give light. Similarly, man in himself is lacking. He only completes himself through his attachment to God, who fills him with the light of his presence. Only then does he become perfected. 13. We must remember that the reason we began to examine the nature of man's existence was that it is a product of reflection of the divine force that sustains all existing things. By analyzing the changes in man's nature, we can understand the nature of this force. Therefore, we can now say that this force also has a dual nature. Potentially, it is extremely elevated, but it has been lowered and made the subject to the effects of evil, dimly reflecting its original light. Once it becomes rectified through the overcoming of evil, God's oneness will be revealed. Then this force will become extremely elevated, perfectly receiving and reflecting God's divine light.
And I guess the text is saying that that's true of the human as well. That, you know, we work on ourselves, we try to overcome the evil, and eventually, hopefully, we reach a state where God then, you know, shines through us, as it were, where we will radiate God's light. Okay.
Part 2, the relationship between God and the Jewish people.
Can I just say, I just wish he didn't draw in these astronomical observations that are just so unfortunately anachronistic and reflect the lack of understanding. You know, the moon and the sun, that the moon was once as bright as the sun. It sort of takes the discussion from a high place to a place of, well, they just didn't know. It's an unfortunate analogy. That's all. I mean, the moon's the moon. It's never going to be as bright as the sun. When, you know, they didn't know that.
Oh, you're going to get a shock when it is, Gil. I'm going to remind you. Look.
Yeah.
You could take it as I think it's okay to take it in a analogous way.
Analogous way, yeah.
Yeah. There's some. It says in the Bereshit story, it says, and God made the great luminaries, the big one and the small one. So the Rashi comments based on the Midrash. You know, what do you mean the great luminaries, the big one and the small one? If they were great, they were both great. So it says that they were both made big, and then God reduced. Actually, the one of them, the one that was going to be the moon, came and complained and said, you know, a king can't wear two crowns. You know, who's the king here? You made both of us. So God says, fine, go and reduce yourself. And that became the moon. So that's, you know, the story behind it. We'll have to think through it. What's the deeper message of that?
Yeah.
I mean, you could already, you know, from this book, obviously, you know, God creating man on this very high level, you know, this potential really, and then saying, well, reduce yourself.
Reduce the luminosity.
In order to then deal with the challenges of life, the evil, overcome it for your ultimate merit. So that's the, you know, yeah, okay. The fortunate parable we have over here to describe what's going on. Okay.
Part 2, the relationship between God and the Jewish people. Rabbi, now the entire system of divine emanations upon the world is only for the sake of the Jewish people, since everything is always aimed towards them, as is written. Your wonders and your thoughts are directed towards us. It follows that the patterns of these divine emanations and the patterns of existence of the Jewish people must certainly correspond to each other. Footnote 14. Until now, we have said that there are two completely different types of divine emanations, those through which God acts upon the world and the divine force that sustains all existing things. Now we see that these two types of emanations actually parallel each other. The explanation is as follows. All the divine emanations that act upon the world are ultimately for our sake and only complete their purpose when we connect to them. We have learned that the existence of the Jewish people is the main manifestation of the divine sustaining force within the world. Therefore, on the non-physical level, it follows that these emanations are actually directed towards the divine sustaining force and that they complete themselves only through their attachment to it. This way, we see that these two types of emanations are connected to each other and parallel one another. Back to the text. Each pattern of divine emanation allows the Jewish people to connect to God correspondingly and to be elevated in a particular designated way. Footnote 15. Since the source of each emanation is God's infinite light, our connection to it enables us to attach ourselves to God. The purpose of each pattern of divine emanation is to enable us to serve God and to rectify the world in a specific way. The connection we have with each pattern affects us in accordance with the function it has and how it comes to elevate us. Back to the text. In fact, you need to know a fundamental principle concerning the task that has been entrusted to man. Footnote 16. Part 1 of this chapter, we outlined the difference between the two main types of emanation and began to define the nature of the emanation that sustains existence. In this section, we examine the relationship between these two types of emanation. We do this by looking at the unique relationship between God and the Jewish people. This is because the dynamics of this relationship are reflected in the relationship between the emanations that act upon the world and the sustaining force of the world. In other words, between HaKodesh Baruch Hu and Shehechina. End of 8. Part 3. When the relationship between God and his people is close, so too the relationship between the forces of creation is close and blessings come down to the world. Back to the text. All other creatures depend totally on God, and every aspect of their existence is simply what they receive automatically from him. They are therefore not masters over their actions or deeds. Their actions have no element of free choice since they are determined directly by God. Only man possesses the unique ability to act out of free choice. He has the ability to decide what he wants to do without being forced. This is what our sages meant when they said everything is in God's hands apart from the fear of God. 17. What happens to a person and the qualities and abilities he has are all in God's hands. How he reacts to all this, and how close he comes to God depend on the person. Back to the text. Of course, man is also dependent on God, just like all the other creatures. It is just that for the sake of his task of serving God, he is given an aspect that does not depend on God at all, but on his own choice. This is the meaning of the statement we quoted. Everything is in God's hands apart from the fear of God. Even human souls, before they actually enter the body, are no different from all other creatures. They are dependent on God since they stay at that stage, they do not yet have the task of serving God through free choice. Only after they enter the body are they given free choice. Then, in this aspect, they are dependent on themselves and not on God. However, it goes without saying that with regard to every other aspect of their existence, they are totally dependent on God, just like every other creature. As they said, everything is in God's hands. See how great is the honor of God is granted to the righteous by considering them his partners in creation. Our sages have stated, do not interpret the verse as saying, you are my people, Ami, but as if it says, you are with me, Imi. 18. The Hebrew word Ami literally means my people. The same letters can also be read Imi, which means with me. The sages therefore find in these words an allusion to the concept that you, the Jewish people, are with me. You are my partners in the work of creation. Back to the text. This is because God is truly left for the righteous a portion in the task of rectifying the world and perfecting creation, as we explained above, chapter 5, part 3. Consequently, this task is divided, as it were, between God and the righteous. It cannot be completed without both of them. In a certain sense, we can almost say that the Jewish people have a relationship of familiarity with God like a wife and husband, since they have a share in the task of perfecting the world, as we explained. As a result, they are able to speak before him and hold their head high. They are not like one who eats someone else's food and is embarrassed to look that person in the face. See chapter 1, part 2. Instead, they bask joyously in the radiance of the divine presence with head held high. However, before souls enter the body and come down to this world, they do not have this relationship with God. They're like a slave who walks behind his master carrying his master's things. Although they are certainly a portion of God above and attached to him. 20. See 3 paragraphs below where the Ramchal explains that the souls always remain the portion of God above because he is their source of origin. Back to the text, they feel embarrassment like a person receiving charity, as we explained. 21. Though the soul, before it enters the body, is very elevated, it is no free choice and does everything out of compulsion. Therefore, it receives not the slightest element of equality in its relationship with God. It only receives without giving back anything at all. It is like a poor person receiving charity, embarrassed to look the giver in the face. There is no closeness to the relationship. But since God has given the Jewish people the possibility of sharing in the task of perfecting the world, which is the purpose of the entire creation, this means that in this aspect, there is a two-way relationship. You're potentially able to give back to the ultimate giver, to look him in the face, as it were. In this limited but awesome sense, we can describe our relationship as having some similarity of husband and wife.
Interesting. Right. So you could look at this whole thing as a way to develop the relationship from one of a slave to one of a spouse, which I guess we all understand is a higher level.
I don't know, I'm not married, so hopefully.
It's theoretical. Once a slave, always a slave. Okay. Okay, you want to go on?
Sure. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai provided a nice analogy to illustrate these two types of relationships. In speaking about someone who prays to God, he stated the following: there is one kind of person who is like a servant who is not so beloved by the king. From his position behind the king, he will have to raise his voice in order to beseech the king for something. The king will decree that his request be granted, but he will not turn his face towards him and will not look at him. There is another type of servant who is beloved by the king. This king will greet him in a friendly manner, turning his face towards him and speaking with him as long as necessary. The Torah uses similar terminology to describe God's relationship with Moshe and the Jewish people. God spoke with you, i.e. the Jewish people, face to face on the mountain from amidst the fire. God spoke with Moshe face to face like a man speaking with his friend. We will likewise find the words of priestly blessing, may God cause the light of his face to shine upon you. However, in another place it states, you will see me from the back, but my face will not be seen. This type of terminology reflects a natural phenomenon. Two friends who wish to show affection to each other will turn their faces towards each other. This demonstrates their closeness. However, when two people distance themselves from one another, each will turn his face away from the other. Turning one's face toward another always expresses that one is attentive to him, while turning one's back expresses estrangement. All these modes of expression can be applied to the relationship. All these modes of expression can be applied to the relationship between the lower worlds as represented by the Jewish people and God. This is footnote 22. In truth, the relationships of face-to-face and back-to-back in the human world are derived from and reflect the structure and relationship of the spiritual forces that God uses to create and guide the world. Really, we are borrowing concepts whose the source is in the higher worlds and applying them in a transferred sense to the physical world rather than the other way around.
At Sinai, it says they saw the sounds. So one of the explanation is that our seeing is reality, right? What we see is more real than what we hear. So they saw the sounds, meaning they realized that the concepts, those actually are that's the real reality, right? The concept is the reality. What we have over here is almost the borrowed, the analogy. So same thing. Okay.
Not to contradict Gil, but he uses this thing of, the light of his face to shine upon you is kind of like the sun shining upon the moon.
Uh-huh.
No contradiction. Just saying
Just wrong.
The moon is not the same process that formed the sun, that's all. Sorry, Ramchal.
Okay. Yeah, let's finish this paragraph. I mean this chapter. So it's one more page.
Sorry. When the lower worlds are perfected at the level appropriate for them, they become very closely attached to God, bound to him with genuine love. In a certain sense, they are like two close friends who turn to face one another. If they have not attained this level and remain unprepared, they of course still supported and sustained by God, as we explained. Footnote 23. When we fail to serve God properly, we do not prepare and elevate ourselves to receive his blessings. As a result, we become distant from him. However, there is still a connection between us, since God continues to sustain our existence, like a husband who continues to support his wife, though he is angry with her. The souls always remain the portion of God above, constantly attached to him, since he is their source and origin. But there is no familiarity in their relationship, nor are they able to raise their heads before him. They are like two people who turn away from each other, indicating an estrangement between them, each one focused on himself and not on the companion. They are sustained by God, but only in the way that one sustains something that is not particularly precious. They are not able to turn and look at him, nor does he turn towards them. But when they become perfected, they gaze at each other with love, as is written, "Show me your appearance, and your appearance is beautiful." The dialogue that takes place in the Song of Songs is essentially about the relationship between two people who love each other. However, our sages, its true intent is to describe the relationship between God and the Jewish people. Here, God is expressing his love for the Jewish people in terms of their looking lovingly at one another. Back to the text. As a result of what we have been discussing, you will understand that although there are certainly no physical forms in the higher worlds, there are certain types of guiding forces and emanations that are called, in a transferred sense, face, and others that are called back. As in the verse we mentioned above, "You will see me from the back, but my face will not be seen." Footnote 25. This verse does not literally mean that Moshe would see God's back, since God is infinite and obviously has no physical form. Rather, it means that he would see those forces that God uses to create and direct the world, but only from a distance, without great intimacy. This is a distant, incomplete understanding of the way God runs the world, not a face-to-face view. Back to the text. It is evident that the types of divine emanations that are called face will have the same characteristics of closeness and love that we find in the human act of turning the face towards somebody. Likewise, the guiding force of emanation called back will have the same characteristics of estrangement that we find in the human act of turning one's back. Through the changing balance between them, these two divine attributes of face or back, we can define the closeness or distance that exists in the relationship between the Jewish people and God. Note 26. We have already mentioned that there are two types of divine emanations, those that act upon the world and the receiving or sustaining force within the world. We have also said that the state of the lower worlds, and particularly of the Jewish people, is a manifestation and reflection of this receiving force. When we use the gift of free choice to turn towards God and perfect the world, we cause a relationship of face-to-face and closeness between these two categories of divine forces. The divine receiving force is able to receive an outpouring of spiritual blessing from the divine emanations that act upon the world, and this blessing then floods down into the world. And God forbid we do not do God's will and turn away from him, we will cause a turning away and rupture between these two sets of spiritual forces, which are then in a state of back-to-back. The potential spiritual blessings cannot be received, and the world is engulfed by spiritual darkness. We see, therefore, that the relationship between God and the Jewish people is always reflected in the relationship between these two types of divine emanation, and that this in turn determines the spiritual light or darkness that exists in the world. Part 2.
All right. What do you take out of that?
High stakes. That's what I take it. It's high stakes. It puts a big onus on the Jewish people, right? This is it's not just about the ultimate sort of revelation of God's oneness and the goodness. It's also sort of really on a real basis. It's like to the extent to which the Jewish people are in accordance with the relationship with God, that, you know, has these sort of manifest consequences of spiritual light or darkness. So it's, I don't know. It's a good thing there's people that are like you, Rabbi, need to be, well, you know, we all have to do our part.
I sometimes wonder that how many of us have to do our part to really bring things, to cause God's face to shine upon us. Do you in any way think God's face is shining upon us today?
I think so. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, sort of like you see, I mean, like Ori was bringing up Viktor Frankl. I mean, or Elie Wiesel, or anyone that's dealt with some kind of real adversity and still has a positive message and lives their life in a way that brings goodness to others, whereas some people would be broken by the experiences of a lot of people. So I think in that strength and resilience, the human spirit, I absolutely think that's manifestation of God in the world. To me, I mean, the survival of the Jewish people itself is a manifestation of God's existence in the world. That's the fundamental one to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he says here.
Yeah, and still talking about these things and still insisting, insisting on the same sort of basic message that there is one God.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It's what's happening in Ukraine and what happened yesterday in the Oscars. It's difficult to say that God is shining his light upon us. No one got that joke. It was very dry.
I didn't get it. Shine a light.
Do you know what happened yesterday at the Oscars?
I know what happened.
Sure. You got to be living under a rock. Rabbi, you know what happened.
Oh, turning his face? Oh, okay.
Oh, the face. Oh, that I didn't. Okay, all right.
Is that what you did?
I was trying to describe the evils in the world, and I said, what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the Oscars. It's difficult to.
I bet you that if you would look on like media, media taking whatever, what's it called? Consumption. There was a lot more media consumption the last 2 days about the Oscars than what's happening in Ukraine.
Of course, I think that's it makes sense. People are looking for something. It doesn't matter if it's frivolous. They want something to distract them from something that's very real and very stark. And kind of, people feel powerless to affect the situation for the better.
Yeah, I was speaking to Jason before. It's a very unsettling time. That's happening. So yeah, that was interesting distraction. But yeah, I agree with you, and I think even in a personal way, if you want to see God's face smiling on you in your life, it's up to you. Mm-hmm. Right, you got to take God seriously. You got to, you got to turn your face to Him. It's very interesting. In the temple, there were these things on top of the cruvim, the cherubim. I don't even know how to say it. How do you say it in English?
Cherubim.
Cherubim. So it was, for a people that are like allergic to idolatry. It was crazy, right? You had these figurines of baby faces with wings, or but the Talmud says they moved, and when they symbolized the relationship, so sometimes they faced each other, and there was a relationship between God and the Jewish people, and sometimes they moved apart. And I think, I imagine God's given us the reins, right? Who chooses who moves first? We do. God's like, I'm ready. I'm always ready. I'm never going to move away from you. I don't know. It'd be interesting to think about that in terms of this book. Does God sometimes? No, he throws in a little bit of evil, which is God turning his face, but it's really for something very, for the challenge, for good, whatever. Okay, it's getting late. Ori needs to go to sleep.
Yeah.
Early. Thank you all. Great week.
Good to see
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Good to see all of you too.
I really want to thank you guys for just plowing on here, because we've gone. It's really pretty out there, and not quite sure what exactly we get from it, but I do feel every week we get something, and there is the overall picture. We're sensing it. If we get it or not, I'm not sure. So thank you,
Rabbi. We get a ton from it, and we are grateful to you. And I wouldn't be surprised if, like me, everyone is counting the pages to see how much we have left, which is an unfortunately short amount.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. Well, Baruch Hashem, there's a lot of Torah to learn.
What are we reading to?
Yeah, so, okay, we had part 3 on the reading. Yeah, I think, let's get to part 5. Yeah, we could finish chapter 8. Okay, less speaking, Gil. Okay?
Very good. Yep.
We want to get through stuff. Okay.
Always good advice from me.
Have a great week, guys.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Guys.